Hello, everyone. Добрий день, Gamarjova. I hope I pronounced it right. My name is Antonyan, and I'm a Ukrainian writer. I'm glad to welcome Damon Galgut, a novelist and playwright from the Republic of South Africa, who is joining us today from London. Hello, Damon. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, glad to be here. Glad to be chatting to you.
Last year, Damon got the Booker Prize for his novel, The Promise. Damon Galgut is the third South African writer to win the prize. The family saga is set against the backdrop of South Africa's political transition. This novel tells the story of the white family, the Swart family, who once promised their longtime servant, a black woman, a house and a land of her own. The family consists of 5 members, as they are called in the novel Ma, Pa, Anton, Astrid, and Amor. So the mother of the family dies, and before dying, after a long illness, she asks her husband to give Salome, that's the servant, a house. But somehow, after her death, Pa forgets about his promise and doesn't want to keep it. The novel has 4 sections and roughly 10 years between each of them. And the narration starts in 1986 at the times of apartheid. Is that right, Damon?
Yes, very accurate so far.
So before we start speaking about the book, I would like to ask you several personal general questions about you and about South Africa. When and from which country did your ancestors, your family, come to South Africa?
On my father's side, I have Jewish ancestry, and they came from Lithuania, Eastern Europe. There was quite a big wave of emigration to South Africa of Jewish people from that area just before the Second World War, and the people who stayed behind, I think, were all killed in the genocide. On my mother's side, the lineage goes back to England, but I think her father had ancestors from Scandinavia. It's a little bit unclear. Not up to speed on the family tree, and not all the knowledge is actually preserved or written down. But yeah, those are the roots of my family.
So you were born in South Africa already, right?
Yes, in Pretoria.
What was it like to grow up in a country with a racial segregation? What would a little boy, you, Damon, think about the state of people of color in the country? And what did the boy see around him? Maybe you have a vivid story as an example.
I mean, it's a very big question because you're really talking about history. I mean, you're born at a particular moment in history, and what you see around you appears to be normal, even if it isn't. I guess it took a while for the fact of racial segregation to dawn on me. Every white family in South Africa has at least one black servant working for them, and that was true of my family too. I grew up with a black woman who was called Salome, in fact, as my nanny, and she was my first encounter with black South Africans, and I absolutely loved her, and she loved me. It was a very close bond. They often are those kinds of connections. But it took some time, I guess, for me to see the larger society and to become aware that there were rules that separated one group from another, that black people were not allowed into so-called white areas after dark, and not without a pass book that gave them permission to be there. I saw various incidents where people who didn't have a pass book or the correct documentation were chased down by police and arrested and dragged away. I remember going with my father once to pick up a black man who worked for my grandfather because he'd been in prison overnight for not having his pass book in correct order. So there were small incidents, I guess, that slowly encroached on my consciousness and then built up into the overall impression that the system we were living with was very severe and very unjust. But the sense of injustice took a long time to arrive, because the message you get from everyone around you is this is normal, this is necessary, this is the way we have to live. And I wasn't aware, obviously, as a child, that the rest of the world was very much opposed to apartheid to the point of boycotting us. I mean, that was an understanding that came much later.
If you compare South Africa in the 90s of the previous century, and I specifically mean 1994 and nowadays, what is the progress in fighting injustice? Is it only a shadow remaining from apartheid now, or is apartheid still almost fully in action? And how much more time is needed for the society to fully recover and declare victory?
Again, a very big question. Look, a great deal has changed in South Africa. It would be misleading to say that wasn't the case. I mean, if just on a day-to-day level, it used to be law that black people and white people could not enter a building through the same entrance, for example. There would be separate doors. We could not sit on the same bench in a park. You were not allowed to have a relationship across the color line. You would not be able to have friends. I would not be able to have black friends to my home for a meal or whatever without attracting the attention of the security police. So on that very immediate physical level, everything has changed. I mean, all those laws have gone, and you know, there's no more of that kind of prioritizing of one race over another, or of separating races from each other. But on a much deeper level, I think it's true to say South Africa has failed to transform. I speak largely about the economic level, because really, I think political power was handed over in South Africa, but economic power was not. I mean, there is, of course, now a quite large black middle class, larger than the white middle class. That was not the case before either. But by and large, the gap between rich and poor has got bigger. I think it's the biggest in the world right now. And it's true to say that most of the rich are white and most of the poor are black. And that was the situation under apartheid. And if anything, it's got worse. So you could say that, you know, things have changed in a superficial way, but on far more meaningful levels under the surface, they have failed to transform completely. And I mean, failed completely to transform. Let me rephrase that. But you asked me how many years it would take, you know, for victory to be declared. Well, that's impossible to answer, because we should by now have transformed far more fundamentally. That's a failure, in my eyes at least, on the part of government. We have had nearly 30 years of democracy, 30 years of opportunity to make these changes. But there's been very little vision and very little will to make sure that's happened. I mean, I think it's common knowledge that, you know, corruption has basically hollowed out the South African state. Money that should have been used to house people, educate people, has instead been stolen. But of course, behind all that, there remains the fact that there is no plan for radical transformation. There's not one party, not one single politician who has a plan that I would believe in. In fact, I'll tell you frankly, I have not voted in the last two South African elections, because there's no party that represents my interests, or any kind of serious, shows any kind of serious intention to get to grips with the problems we face. So can you vote against all the parties who take part in the elections? Don't you afraid that your voices will be taken and maybe manipulated, you know, to support some party to go to power? Or you don't have that kind of corruption? No, I don't. No, I don't think our voting system has been corrupted. I think the votes are by and large a fair reflection of how people vote. But yes, I mean, I could spoil my vote, and in fact, that's probably the responsible thing to do as a minor act of protest. But I don't.
It's also a message to the government, you know, writing maybe some phrase from your novel, which tells it all. You know, very symbolic.
Yeah, you may be right, but I think our government is especially impervious to messages, I'm afraid.
Okay, they should read books. I'm sure, as any other government of any other country. So you live in the country, of course, you know what's going on there, and you see all the details. You see everything what's going on. That's why you're saying that the country failed to transform. But if a tourist comes to the country, will he or she notice that something is wrong, and what exactly? Like just simple, I don't know, something will ring the bell. Something is going on here. Something is still not right.
Well, I can tell you that if you arrive at the airport in South Africa and you drive into the center of Cape Town, you're going to drive for the first 10 minutes through areas that were designated by the apartheid government for black people, and that you will see shacks and appalling conditions on either side of the highway. Those conditions improve as you get closer to the city, and you will then see what looks like a normally functioning modern city, occupied mostly by white people. So yes, on the most immediate and obvious level, you will see apartheid in action. I had an American friend visiting some years ago, and we'd gone to a few restaurants during her visit, and she pointed out to me, I mean, it's a reflection on my own myopia, I guess. She pointed out to me that almost all the patrons at the restaurant were white and all the wait staff were black, which is exactly how, the racial divisions of the past used to work. Now, I don't think that's quite as evident up north in Johannesburg, which is a far more integrated city. If you go out to eat or, enjoy some nightlife, the crowd is much more mixed racially. So you might think, well, this is a happy society, but, you have only to look at a local newspaper or speak to a couple of locals to understand quite how bitter the divisions still are. No, I don't think on an obvious physical level that you would think you were in a normal place.
Thank you for that answer. Right now, I'd like to go closer to the book. I'd like to speak about the Promise novel. I'd like to speak about one of the main characters of the novel. I don't know if you call it a character or not. It's Death. I would even say it's most important character there because it moves the plot, it moves the story. Though you don't really personify it, but there are 4 sections of the novel, 4 deaths. Why death? Why funerals? Is it just a natural final stage of life, or do you intend to remind us one more time, hey, people, everybody dies and no one will be able to take a farm or a piece of land to the other world, so don't be greedy, share?
Well, it's a bit of all of that, actually. But the very first idea I got for the book was from a conversation with a friend who was telling me about his own 4 family funerals, his parents, his brother, and his sister. I mean, he's older than me, so these deaths were not out of time, shall we say. But I got the idea from that conversation because I thought, well, I read a lot of novels about families, but I never read one that had this particular structure. And the structure suited me or suited my concerns because as I get older, I think about dying, like all of us do.
Even me, yeah.
Well, it's the end of your life, right? And it's the moment where if your life has any meaning, that comes into clear focus. So, for me, really, the book is about time passing, and time for me is the medium through which all change happens. I mean, individual change, we all know how our lives, our faces, our bodies change as we get older. But of course, a nation changes too. I mean, South Africa has changed quite dramatically. But the end of our individual journey through time ends with a funeral. So it doesn't seem like an unnatural point around which to gather, these 4 sections of the story.
Right now, it's the moment for you to read a passage from the novel. You're welcome to present what you decided to read for us. You told me before we started the live streaming that this is the first time you're going to read this very passage.
Yeah, I thought I'd choose something I hadn't read before just to keep myself entertained and hopefully you as well.
Of course.
The passage is from the first section of the book, and it deals with, or rather it begins with Salome, who is the black lady to whom this promise has been made. And the mother of the family has just been buried, and Salome has not been allowed to go to the funeral. So she has stayed at her little house, which is the one that's been promised to her, and she's said a prayer for the mother of the family. But in any case, after some time has passed, which is certainly true, see how the shadow of the anthill has moved, for the sun is no longer at its highest point. She gets up slow and stiff from the chair and goes back inside. And she emerges again after another unmeasured interval. She's wearing her usual clothes, her ragged dress and slip-slops, a cloth tied over her hair, and she sets off along the footpath around the kopje. It might be any day. She walks this path every morning and back again at night, and often a couple of times in between. All lights and all weathers. Hard to tell one journey from another. When she gets to the back door, she leaves her slip-slops outside and proceeds barefoot. Her uniform hangs in the pantry, blue dress with white doek and white apron, and she's allowed to use the bathroom for 2 minutes to change. Then hangs her own clothes out of sight round the corner in the pantry. Only now can she go further, into the deeper reaches of the house. The family has returned, or maybe they never left. They give off an air of rootedness, of being dug in. Let's say they're sitting around the dining room table, or standing at different angles in the lounge, or out on the front stoop, one party down in the driveway and the other in the more commanding position above. It doesn't matter. The following exchange takes place between Mani and his eldest child somewhere. I have thought about your words the other night, Pa says, and I am very angry. At moments like these, he likes to model his tone on the Old Testament God and expects, therefore, to be obeyed. Yes? Not for my sake, but for the sake of others. That you were rude to me is nothing new. I expected. But the way you spoke to the dominee, a holy man, a preacher. Anton sniffs and smiles. A fool and a charlatan. That's enough. The disrespect stops today. Listen now and hear me well. If you don't apologize to him, you are out of this family. I will never speak to you again. For Mani has brooded upon the events of the previous evening like a hen upon a huge black egg. You have offended my marriage and my religion, and you shall pay. You must know, Pa, that I can never do it. Can't help you, between you and your conscience. I won't say sorry to that man. For what? I only spoke the truth. The truth. Mani is outraged afresh, even the bristles on his chin standing out like little spikes. About my wife, about promises I didn't make. Choose your side, it's up to you, but if you do not humble yourself, you are out in the wilderness. Only when their father is gone, making a loud and righteous exit, does his younger daughter show herself, emerging from behind a pot plant like a character in a farce. Anton, I heard what he said. What is it, Amor? He speaks irritably, for she's spoiling what might otherwise be a high, clear moment for him, to be cast out from the family, to be free of all this. I heard what Pa said to you, and it isn't right. What isn't right? He did promise. I heard him. He promised Ma he would give Salome her house. Her little face is lit from within by its sureness. Amor, he says gently. What? Salome can't own the house. Even if Pa wanted to, he can't give it to her. Why not? She says, puzzled. Because, he says, it's against the law. The law? Why? You're not serious. But then he looks at her and sees how serious she is. Oh, dear me, he says. Do you have no idea what country you're living in? No, she doesn't. Amor is 13 years old. History has not yet trod on her. She has no idea what country she's living in. She has seen black people running away from the police because they're not carrying their passbooks, and heard adults talking in urgent, low voices about riots in the townships. And only last week at school they had to learn a drill about hiding under tables in case of attack. And still, she doesn't know what country she's living in. There's a state of emergency, and people are being arrested and detained without trial. And there are rumors flying around, but no solid facts, because there's a blackout on news, and only happy, unreal stories are being reported. But she mostly believes these stories. She saw her brother's head bleeding yesterday from a rock, but still, even now, she doesn't yet know who threw the rock or why. Blame it on the lightning. She's always been a slow child. One thing, though, perturbs her. But why, she says. Why did you tell Pa to give Salome our house if you knew he couldn't? He shrugs. Because, he says, I felt like it. And it's exactly then, in the tiniest way, without even knowing it herself, that she begins to understand what country she's living in. So I'll leave it there.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much for reading this passage. When I was reading the novel, I had a constant feeling that scenes are like still art paintings, still life. Not only because death is there, literally x-raying the characters and their actions, but also due to rather detailed descriptions. Every phrase is like a stroke of a brush. Yet, at the same time, many scenes are turgent with sap through the whole plot. They are as if overflowing with strong emotions. What's your secret, apart from literary talent to describe, of course? Did you have to maybe study more human nature before writing this novel, or maybe consult a specialist like a psychologist on how people feel and act in this or that situation?
No, I didn't do any extra consultation. It's interesting you use the analogy of painting, because it felt to me, I voiced this to a writer friend while I was busy, it felt to me like I was painting more than writing, and I couldn't explain to him what I meant, and I'm not sure I can explain it now. It felt in this case that working with language was like laying down textures rather than the kind of linear flow that's a plot-driven novel. This is a far more language-driven story, and the language is, of course, what evokes each particular scene or moment. But, all of this is very, very close under the skin for me, because, the novel covers about 40 years in total, but these are the 40 years of my adult life. I mean, the years from when I became, when I grew up, left home, and began to live my own life independently, and think independently and feel independently of my family. So there was not any research required, really, although none of this is based directly on my family or anyone else. All of it is made from fragments of memory, of impressions from my childhood, and my adult years too. These are all people I've seen, or, assemblies of pieces of people I've seen and incidents I've lived through. There's no special research required.
It's your personal experience, and observations, and I quite understand that. Of course, it's pretty obvious. But what about bodies? And one thing is to describe bodies who get older, because we're also human beings who have our own bodies. We notice what's going on with us. But what about dead bodies? Some of the descriptions during the funerals made me think that probably you consulted some specialist, or I don't know, your friends working in the morgue or something. How did you know all those details?
Well, I don't, is the truth. I mean, of course, one one has to check on certain things. But a lot of those little details that you might be referring to actually were brought up by the particular friend I mentioned, who was telling me about his own 4 family funerals. For example, the undertaker, who's dressing a body at some point. This was a scene he himself witnessed. And he's a very funny guy, this friend of mine, and he's a theater director, so he tends to notice the kinds of details that other people maybe wouldn't, which reveal the character of the people taking part in the scene. But like any novelist, if you don't really know the facts, you research them, but the essential part of the scene is not the facts, it's how your imagination makes the facts stand up. So really, I'm not doing anything different to what I normally do in writing a novel, and that's trying to understand the parameters of a scene and then inhabiting it imaginatively and trying to make it live.
Yeah, it was very vivid. I could even feel that. I'm also attending the funeral, so it's really, really bright. Now about the family, the Swart family. What was missing in the Swart family that they seem never to be really together except for the funerals? How did it happen that the land was almost the only thing that more or less united them?
Well, it's true they're a very dysfunctional family, but that's not that unusual, really. I mean, not every family is a happy family, and as Tolstoy said, happy families are all alike in the same way. Unhappy families are all unhappy in their own particular way. So I guess they're dysfunctional in the way that a lot of families that I remember from my childhood were. And I mean, that includes my own. Our family was not a very harmonious one. There was a lot of internal conflict and tension. But I think that's true for quite a lot of South African families of that period, and maybe still now. If there's a sort of a national tension, it tends to get reflected on the family level too, I think, and especially if families lack love. I think what happens is the siblings begin to compete for what little attention or love there might be available, and that tends to create fractures and divisions. But on a much simpler level, it's far more interesting to write about groups of people who are tense and at odds than it is to write about a harmonious group. Harmony tends to be boring from a literary perspective. Conflict is always...
Of course, we need conflict all the time.
Yeah, that's what keeps you reading, right? If you have a conflict, the implicit promise is that the conflict will be resolved, and what's holding your attention is how that happens. So yeah, it's a basic literary principle, I think.
Salome, the black servant of the Swart family, is almost silent in the novel, just a few phrases coming out of her mouth. I can imagine that in the past, even if indigenous people would say something, on the country scale, I mean, on a national level, no one or almost no one wanted to hear them. Did you intentionally silence Salome? Is the voice of native people still not heard in South Africa, or maybe not enough heard in South Africa?
Most certainly. I mentioned earlier that I had a black nanny called Salome when I was small.
Yeah.
She was exactly the sort of person I had in mind. I expected her to be there. I expected her to be looking after me because I was a child, I guess. But as you grow up, you realize that she's just one of many, a whole army of women, quite similar, rural women, not highly educated, who are there to look after the children, largely of white families, very often with children of their own who get left behind at home. But the inner lives of such people are not apparent or real to white South Africans, by and large. I mean, there are exceptions, but mostly white South Africans do not imagine or perceive what it feels like internally to be a black South African. And that sort of deadness of imagination is kind of it was, I guess, kind of necessary for apartheid to work, because if you were too imaginatively engaged, the system would not be bearable. So largely, I think that deadness, that blank spot, has persisted into the so-called new South Africa, because the economic system where there are black people working for white people has persisted too. So I wanted to reflect this. I mean, the perspective of the novel is very much focused on white South Africans. It's about white South Africa. And I wanted that blind spot, that empty blankness in the middle of the map, to be problematic for readers. I wanted it to be bothersome, so that by the time a reader comes to the end of the book, they would want the answer to that question. Who is Salome? Why is she silent? Why is she so important in the story, and yet we don't know her? My hope is that the reader will carry that problem beyond the cover of the book when they're finished reading it, and perhaps in some way their preoccupation with it will help them to find a solution in the real world.
One of the most dramatic parts in the novel, personally for me, it's when Amor, so to say, speaks to her brother by reading his unfinished novel. You know, it's a very touching moment because they were never really close. She was hiding from her family, so Anton never got to know her as an adult. She didn't know how much. She didn't know much about her brother, his sufferings, adventures, and turbulences. So he is dreaming to write this novel, and then you tell us that the novel has 4 sections, according to 4 seasons, as the phases of human life. Of course, we see parallels with you personally, right? And you already actually told us that your nanny was named, what's called Salome. So how much does Anton have from you, actually? And speaking about other characters, who got more of your own experience, life experience?
You know, you can't really create a realistic character without drawing on some aspect of yourself. So, I mean, it would be fair to say that every character of substance in the book reflects, to some extent, an aspect of me. I mean, maybe exaggerated to an effective degree, but still, you're pulling these emotional shapes out of your own nature. Otherwise, you can't make them live. Anton's more or less my age. I'm a white male. I understand him, let's say, in a way that doesn't require a huge intellectual or imaginative jump, which some of the other characters might require. And I had a lot of fun's not the right word, but I was very engrossed in the creation of Anton. He's very self-aware, intelligent, but very much in conflict with himself, and a very interesting character to work with. But it's equally true to say that Amor, the youngest daughter, and she represents really the other pole of the novel. If Anton's the negative pole, she's the positive one. She's also an aspect of myself, let's say the better part of my nature. The part of my nature that would like to do the right thing, that doesn't want to be powerful or privileged in a society where power and privilege go with being white, but is trying to find a way out of that particular labyrinth, and not really able to, except in small gestures, maybe, of renunciation. So, yeah, I mean, I've given a certain metaphorical shape to what is also a very personal memory of mine. I mean, when I was 6 years old, I was very ill as a child. I got a kind of lymphoma, which kept me in hospital for a long time, and really shaped my consciousness. I mean, 6 is a very young age to be dealing with a calamity. So I gave something similar to Amor in the form of being struck by lightning at the age of 6. When she's sitting on this little hill, and that lightning strike has very clearly affected her personality. You know, she is the one person in the family who wants to do the moral thing and give Salome her house. but this moral impulse is perceived by other people in the family as being strange, odd, and part of the oddness of her after being struck by lightning. So, I mean, these are all aspects of character that go very deep, and which I can relate back to my own life. But you could pick out almost any character, and it's either a memory of someone I knew, or some aspect of them, or it's some part of myself which I've kind of worked up into a shape with definition and outline. At least I hope.
You've just said that Amor is the brighter part of you. Is that because that's why she's called Amor? I mean, is it a coincidence? Because it sounds Amor, love, from Spanish, from Italian. Is that the love part of your life in a broader way? Not like.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if South Africa is not a country in which love is prevalent, and definitely not the time at which I grew up. It was a hard country, an unkind and cruel place. I mean, that's softened in lots of ways, it has to be said. But yes, I mean, I'm consciously given her the name Amor because I'm suggesting she is the impulse towards love, or certainly towards kindness in the book. But it's also a fairly common Afrikaans name in South Africa. Maybe doesn't have quite the same ring that it would have in Europe, where maybe it sounds exotic and it has a certain weight to it. In South Africa, perhaps to the South African ear, it has a little bit of an ironic sound, and maybe a little bit of a common edge to it. But it's still a plausible Afrikaans name, Amor Swart.
You see, it's all personal experience, because you're reading this novel and getting to know this character. I right away noticed her name, and it really proved itself, because she is the moral stand, the moral base of the family, and she wants to do right. So, and in general, her view of the world, this is love. This is love. This is what gives a ray of light, actually, to the whole novel. I'm going to quote you right now. South Africans are tone deaf to irony. Impossible in this country to speak for anyone except yourself. The Promise is a serious piece of literature, and it is quite full of irony. What was the reaction of your compatriots to the novel? In general, what do they say?
Well, I suppose a lot of those conversations happen when I'm not around. So I don't know at dinner tables in South Africa how the book is generally discussed. I was very touched and relieved, I might say, at the reaction that I did hear from South Africans. I mean, the book got very warmly received and well reviewed in South Africa. And from what I gather, especially by Black South Africans, which was really gratifying to me, because obviously I worry about that perception. But I was worried about the reaction of white South Africans too, obviously because the book is very harsh in its judgments of white South Africans. But by and large, the dialogue around it has been really reflective, thoughtful. The reception has been warm. I have to add, though, that the kind of people who might have been angered or upset by the book are probably not the kind of people who read novels. So, in fact, it might have passed those South Africans by completely. The readership in South Africa is very small, always has been, especially for serious books. So, the people who probably ought to be reading the book are the kind of people who probably never pick up a novel, and certainly not a novel like this.
It's a brilliant novel. You started writing from early age. Your first novel was published when you were 17. It's amazing. Wow. Applauses for that. And most probably you were a rather different person and now an absolutely different writer through all the years of life and experience. What piece of advice would you give as a professional writer now to yourself back in the past as a beginner?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I should probably say I'm not very proud of that first book. It's a very adolescent piece of work. I was proud of it at the time.
Anyway, you got published.
I got published, yeah. Well, the advice that I give all young writers is to persist. I mean, just keep on because you have to, and to read as much as possible. But that's not really advice I need to give my younger self, because I clearly did persist against all odds, because there were times my career was really going nowhere. And reading continues to be one of the great pleasures of my life. So I guess I don't have any advice aside from that, except to say, it's a long game. It's a long game, and not to expect to win in the short term. You have to strategize over years, right? Each book is like a kind of relationship you enter into, no? I mean, you're going to be living with this presence in your life, your home, your head, for 3 or 4 years, and you have to commit to it completely, even though this is a relationship that it's going to end in a breakup one day. But unlike, I don't know, writing a song or other art forms, doing a painting, which you can complete maybe in a couple of days. This is something that's created over a span of time. You're not the same person when you finish writing a book as you were when you started. Your commitment has to be on a whole other sort of level. So I guess my advice to my younger self would be patience, play the long game, wait your time. The time will come if you believe it,
That's a great advice. What are you working on at the moment? Do you plan, or maybe you have already started a new book? And should we expect, or could you promise a happy book about South Africa?
I mean, this year, since winning the Booker Prize, has been so unbelievably busy. I haven't worked on anything this year except book talk. But I was busy with a collection of short stories, and I hope to get back to those next year. I can't promise you a happy book about South Africa, because I always try to tell the truth, and my country is not in a happy state at the moment. I would like to write a happy book. Certainly, I find a lot of life very funny. I think humor is our great defense against tragedy. So I hope, I think I did manage to hit a tone of humor with this book, and I hope it's one I can explore a bit further. But humor and happiness are not necessarily the same.
It's true. We have just 2 minutes, less than 2 minutes, to finish our conversation. And I have a last question. It's not actually a question. It's more like a little favor. Could you please say something encouraging to the Ukrainian part of our audience, to the people of Ukraine?
Well, I certainly could. I mean, it's been an inspiration to watch from afar how Ukraine has withstood this unprovoked attack. And how, in fact, they seem to be pushing it right back. I come from a country where it felt as if history was absolutely against us and very, very hard to beat. And yet, when change came, it came very, very fast. That process can be hard to read, but I would say to Ukraine, keep on, because your strength and your persistence will win in the end. And the eyes of the world are very much on you. So keep going.
Slava Ukraini. Thank you so much, Damon Galgut. We were speaking about South Africa and the Booker Prize novel, The Promise. Thank you very much for this lovely conversation.
Thank you, too. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.